She was hired as a caregiver for the arrogant millionaire's mother, but over time, they discovered that love can blossom in the most unexpected places. The shrill sound of the doorbell echoed through the Hartley mansion, making Aveline Morgan jump with fright. She took a deep breath, adjusted the collar of her simple blouse, and smoothed out the non-existent creases in her skirt. This was the moment. Her interview for the position of private caregiver to Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, mother of the infamous tech tycoon, Mitchell Hartley. Aveline couldn't help but smile wryly as she thought about how her life had brought her to this point. Just 6 months ago, she was a promising nursing resident at one of Chicago's best hospitals. Now, she was about to enter the home of one of San Francisco's wealthiest and most influential families, not as a doctor, but as a caregiver. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. "You must be Miss Morgan. Please come in." Aveline nodded, entering the majestic foyer. Her eyes quickly scanned the luxurious details, the Italian marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the works of art that were surely worth more than she would ever earn in her entire life. "Mrs. Hartley is looking forward to meeting you," said the woman, leading Aveline through a corridor. "Mr. Hartley is also at home today, something rather unusual. He likes to personally supervise certain things." Aveline felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had researched Mitchell Hartley, brilliant, ruthless in business, and, according to the tabloids, an arrogant playboy with a volatile temper. Not exactly the kind of person she would want to deal with at a job interview. They arrived in a large living room overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Sitting in an elegant armchair was Eleanor Hartley, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess Aveline's every move. "Mother, this is Aveline Morgan," announced a male voice from a corner of the room. Aveline turned and her heart almost stopped. Mitchell Hartley was even more impressive in person than in the photos. Tall, with broad shoulders and aristocratic features, he exuded an aura of power and confidence that made Aveline feel instantly intimidated. "Miss Morgan," he said, approaching with determined steps, "I hope you're prepared. Looking after my mother is not a task for just anyone." Aveline straightened her shoulders, determined not to be intimidated. "Mr. Hartley, I can assure you that I'm more than qualified for this position. My experience as a nurse—" "Yes, he interrupted her, making a nonchalant gesture with his hand. "We've read your CV. What puzzles me is why someone with your background is applying for a position as a caregiver." The condescending tone in his voice made Aveline's blood boil. She was about to reply when Eleanor Hartley spoke for the first time. "Mitchell, dear, don't be rude. Miss Morgan came here for an interview, not an interrogation." The lady's voice was soft, but carried an authority that made Mitchell recoil slightly. Aveline felt a wave of gratitude for the intervention. "I apologize for my son's impetuosity, Miss Morgan," said Eleanor, gesturing for Aveline to sit down. "Why don't you tell me a little about yourself?" Over the next few minutes, Aveline talked about her background, her experience at the hospital, and her desire to provide more personalized care. She watched as Eleanor's eyes sparkled with interest, while Mitchell remained silent, observing the interaction with an unreadable expression. "Well, I must say I'm impressed," declared Eleanor after Aveline's explanation. "Mitchell, what do you think?" The man shrugged, his face a mask of indifference. "If you like her, Mom, that's fine with me. But remember, the final decision is yours." Eleanor smiled, turning to Aveline. "In that case, Miss Morgan, I'd like to offer you the job. When could you start?" Aveline blinked, surprised at the speed of the decision. Well, I can start immediately, if it's convenient for you." "Excellent," exclaimed Eleanor, clapping her hands lightly. "Mitchell, why don't you show Miss Morgan to her quarters while we discuss the final details?" Mitchell frowned, clearly unhappy with the task. "Mom, I have a video conference in 10 minutes. I can't just—" "Nonsense," interrupted Eleanor with a smile. "Your business can wait 5 minutes. Go on, show our new employee where she'll be staying." With an exasperated sigh, Mitchell motioned for Aveline to follow him. They left the room in silence, climbing an imposing marble staircase. "Your quarters are in this wing," he said, his voice cold and professional. "You'll have a bedroom, a private bathroom, and a small living room. I hope that's adequate." Aveline nodded, struggling to keep up with Mitchell's long strides. "I'm sure it will be more than adequate, Mr. Hartley. I appreciate the opportunity." He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His intense green eyes seemed to pierce Aveline's soul. "Let me be clear, Ms. Morgan. My mother may have liked you, but I still have my reservations. A bright past doesn't guarantee a bright future. Prove your worth, or this will be a very short stay." Before Aveline could reply, he had already turned and was walking down the stairs, leaving her alone in the hallway. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. What had just happened? How had she gone from a simple interview to being hired and threatened in a matter of minutes? Entering her new quarters, Aveline was greeted by a luxury she had never experienced before. The king-size bed, the elegant furniture, the breathtaking view of San Francisco Bay, it all seemed like something out of a dream. But the reality of the situation soon dawned on her. She was now employed by one of the most powerful families in the country. Her patient was a seemingly kind woman, but her son, Mitchell Hartley, was an enigma. Arrogant, intimidating, but with something in his eyes that suggested hidden layers of complexity. Aveline knew that the next few months would be a challenge like no other she had ever faced. Looking after Eleanor would only be part of her job. Navigating the turbulent waters that Mitchell Hartley represented would be the real test. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Aveline allowed herself a moment of doubt. Had she made a mistake in taking this job? Was she prepared for what came next? But then she remembered why she was there. The need for a fresh start, the opportunity to make a difference in someone's life, and maybe, just maybe, the chance to prove her worth not just to the Hartleys, but to herself. With renewed determination, Aveline stood up. She would face this challenge head-on. Mitchell Hartley might be intimidating, but she wasn't someone who scared easily. And who knows, maybe there was more to this situation than first met the eye. The sound of footsteps in the corridor brought her back to reality. It was time to start her new life as Mrs. Eleanor Hartley's carer. And, like it or not, that meant that Mitchell Hartley was now part of her life. Aveline adjusted her posture, preparing herself for what was to come. Little did she know that the events that would unfold over the next few months would change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains, waking Aveline from a restless sleep. For a moment, she felt disoriented, until the reality of her new situation hit her. She was at Hartley Manor, ready for her first official day as Eleanor's carer. Aveline got up, determined to start the day on the right foot. She dressed neatly, opting for a simple but elegant outfit, black pants and a light blue blouse that highlighted her eyes. She wanted to look professional but approachable. Descending the stairs, Aveline was greeted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the soft sound of conversation coming from the kitchen. As she entered the spacious, modern room, she found Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," Eleanor smiled warmly. "I hope you slept well. Please help yourself to coffee or tea, whichever you prefer." Aveline returned the smile, feeling instantly more relaxed in the lady's presence. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartley. I slept very well, thank you. And please, you can call me Aveline." As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Aveline noticed Mitchell's absence. Part of her felt relieved not to have to deal with his intimidating presence first thing in the morning, but another part was curious about his routine. As if reading her thoughts, Eleanor commented, "Mitchell usually leaves for the office early. He's dedicated to his work." Aveline nodded, taking a seat at the table. "I see. Well, I'm looking forward to starting our day, Mrs. Hartley. Would you like to tell me a little about your usual routine?" Over the next few minutes, Eleanor detailed her typical day, a morning stroll around the estate gardens, followed by a few hours of reading or painting, depending on her mood. Afternoons were usually reserved for physiotherapy sessions and, occasionally, visits from friends. "And, of course, there are the dinners with Mitchell when he's at home," Eleanor added, a shadow of sadness passing through her eyes. Although that doesn't happen as often as I'd like. Aveline felt a twinge of empathy. It was clear that, despite all the wealth and luxury, there was a palpable loneliness in Eleanor's life. "Well, let's make your days brighter then," Aveline said enthusiastically. "How about we start with that walk in the garden?" Eleanor's face lit up at the suggestion. Together, they went out into the estate's vast gardens. Aveline marveled at the beauty of the place. Roses in full bloom, murmuring fountains and breathtaking views of San Francisco Bay. As they walked, Eleanor shared stories about the estate and her family. Aveline listened attentively, absorbing every detail and occasionally asking questions. She noticed how Eleanor became animated when talking about the past, especially Mitchell's early years. "He wasn't always so intense," Eleanor said with a sigh. "There was a time when Mitchell smiled more, laughed more, but after his father passed away and he took over the family business, well, things changed." Aveline nodded understandingly. Losing a father must have been difficult for him, and taking on so much responsibility at such a young age. "Yes, it was a challenging time for all of us," Eleanor agreed. "But sometimes I wonder if Mitchell didn't lose his way a little. He became so focused on proving his worth, on exceeding everyone's expectations, that he forgot how to live." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. To Aveline's surprise, it was Mitchell, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, walking towards her with determined steps. "Mom?" he greeted with a brief kiss on Eleanor's cheek. His eyes then turned to Aveline, cold and calculating. "Miss Morgan." "Mr. Hartley," Aveline replied, keeping her composure. "We didn't expect to see you home at this hour." A wry smile played on Mitchell's lips. "Of course. I came to pick up some documents I'd forgotten. I see you're familiarizing yourself with the property." There was something in his tone that made Aveline feel as if she was being accused of something, although she didn't know exactly what. "Mitchell," Eleanor interjected, her voice carrying a note of warning. "Aveline is doing an excellent job. In fact, this is the first time in weeks that I've felt up to taking such a long walk through the gardens." Mitchell's expression softened slightly on hearing his mother's words. For a brief moment, Aveline glimpsed a vulnerability in his eyes, quickly masked. "Well, I'm glad to hear it," he said, his voice softer. "I need to get back to the office now. Mom, don't try too hard. Miss Morgan, I trust you'll take good care of her." With an abrupt nod, Mitchell turned and left, leaving Aveline with a mixed feeling of relief and frustration. How could someone be so difficult to decipher? The rest of the day went smoothly. Aveline helped Eleanor with her physiotherapy sessions, read to her in the afternoon, and made sure she took her medication on time. As the sun began to set, tinging the sky with shades of gold and pink, Aveline found herself reflecting on her first day. It was clear that caring for Eleanor would be more than just meeting her physical needs. There was a loneliness there, a need for companionship and understanding that went beyond medical care. And then there was Mitchell, an enigma wrapped in an expensive suit, whose actions and words seemed to be in constant conflict. As she prepared Eleanor for the evening, helping her settle into her luxurious bed, Aveline was surprised by a gentle touch on her arm. "Aveline, darling," Eleanor said softly, "I want you to know that I'm truly grateful that you're here. I know my son can seem difficult at times, but he has a good heart. He just needs someone to remind him of that from time to time." Aveline smiled, feeling a wave of affection for the older woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley. I promise to do my best, for you and your family." Leaving Eleanor's room, Aveline made her way back to her chambers, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She knew she had taken on more than just a job. She had entered a complex world of family dynamics, unspoken expectations, and possibly buried secrets. As she prepared for bed, Aveline couldn't help but think of Mitchell. There was something about him, behind that cold, controlled facade, that intrigued her. A part of her, a part she quickly tried to silence, wondered if there was a way to break through those barriers, to see the man Eleanor insisted still existed behind the ruthless tycoon. Shaking her head to dispel these thoughts, Aveline forced herself to concentrate on the present, Her job was to look after Eleanor, not to unravel the mysteries of Mitchell Hartley. With that resolution in mind, she lay down, letting sleep envelop her. Little did Aveline know that the coming days would bring challenges and revelations that would test not only her skills as a carer, but also her ability to see beyond appearances and touch seemingly untouchable hearts. The weeks passed, and Aveline gradually adjusted to the routine of the Hartley mansion. Her mornings began early, preparing breakfast for Eleanor and helping her with her morning medication. Afternoons were filled with a mixture of therapeutic activities and leisure time, from painting sessions to shared readings of literary classics. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that the delicate balance Aveline had established was suddenly upset. Eleanor was sitting comfortably in her favorite armchair in the library, a book of poetry on her lap, when the door opened abruptly. Mitchell walked in, his face a mask of worry and irritation. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, barely casting a glance in Aveline's direction. "It's about the charity dinner next week." Eleanor sighed, closing the book. "Mitchell, darling, we've already discussed it. I don't feel up to attending this year." "But you have to be there," Mitchell insisted, his voice tense. "It's the 20th anniversary of Dad's foundation. Your absence would be noticed and commented on." Aveline watched the interaction silently, feeling the tension growing in the room. She could see the conflict in Eleanor's eyes, the desire to please her son fighting against her own reluctance. "Mr. Hartley," Aveline finally intervened, her voice soft but firm. "Perhaps we can find a middle ground, something that meets everyone's needs without compromising Mrs. Hartley's health." Mitchell turned to her, his eyes sparking with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "With all due respect, Miss Morgan, this is a family matter. And as your mother's caregiver, her well-being is my responsibility," Aveline replied, remaining calm in the face of Mitchell's intense gaze. "Perhaps we can discuss options that allow Mrs. Hartley to participate in a way that isn't exhausting for her." For a moment, silence reigned in the library. Eleanor looked from Aveline to Mitchell, an expression of admiration on her face. Mitchell, for his part, seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Finally, he spoke, his voice more controlled. "Very well, Miss Morgan. What are your suggestions?" Aveline felt a flash of triumph, quickly suppressed by the seriousness of the situation. "We could consider limited participation. Perhaps Mrs. Hartley could attend just for the initial part of the event, making a brief appearance and a short speech, if she wishes. We could organize a private space for her to rest between the public moments." Eleanor nodded slowly. That could work. Mitchell, what do you think?" Mitchell seemed to be considering the proposal, his eyes fixed on Aveline with a new intensity. "It's a reasonable idea," he finally admitted. "I'll make the necessary arrangements." With that, he turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Ms. Morgan, I'd like to discuss the details with you later. My office, 7 p.m. Before Aveline could reply, he had already left, leaving her with a feeling of apprehension and, surprisingly, a touch of anticipation. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, with Aveline torn between looking after Eleanor and mentally preparing for her meeting with Mitchell. When the clock finally struck 7 p.m., she found herself in front of his imposing office door, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She knocked softly and, hearing a brusque "come in," opened the door. Mitchell's office was exactly as she had imagined. Elegant, organized, and intimidating. Large windows offered a panoramic view of the city, now illuminated by the twilight lights. Mitchell was standing behind a massive mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on some documents. "Sit down, Miss Morgan," he said, without raising his eyes. Aveline obeyed, watching Mitchell as he finished reading whatever was in his hands. Finally, he looked at her, his green eyes intense and unreadable. "Your intervention today was unexpected," he began. Aveline braced herself for a rebuke, but Mitchell surprised her. "And appreciated," he continued, his voice softer. "You showed an understanding of my mother's needs that I've perhaps neglected of late." The admission caught Aveline off guard. For a moment, She glimpsed a vulnerability in Mitchell that she had never seen before. "Mr. Hartley," she replied carefully, "I only want the best for your mother. And I believe that includes finding a balance between your social obligations and her well-being." Mitchell nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. Sometimes, in the midst of all the demands of business and social expectations, I lose sight of what really matters." He moved to sit on the edge of the table, closer to Aveline. She felt a sudden warmth creep up her neck, aware of his closeness. "Tell me, Miss Morgan," Mitchell said, his voice low and intense, "what really brought you to this job? A qualified nurse like you would certainly have had other options." Aveline hesitated, taken aback by the personal question, but there was something in Mitchell's expression, a genuine curiosity, that made her answer honestly. I needed a change," she admitted. "After years of working in hospitals, dealing with case after case, I felt I was losing the human connection that brought me to nursing in the first place. I wanted to make a difference in someone's life in a more personal, meaningful way." Mitchell studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decipher a complex puzzle. "And you think you found that here?" Aveline smiled softly. "I'm beginning to believe so. Your mother is a remarkable woman, Mr. Hartley. Looking after her has been rewarding in ways I didn't expect." Something in Mitchell's expression changed, a momentary softness passing through his eyes. "She's very fond of you, you know. She says you've brought light back into her days." Aveline's heart warmed at these words. "I'm glad to hear it. She's brought light back into my days, too." A comfortable silence fell over them, broken only by the soft ticking of an old clock in the corner of the room. Aveline found herself studying Mitchell's face, noticing for the first time the small lines of concern around his eyes, the slight frown that seemed to be a constant expression. "Mr. Hartley," she began hesitantly, "if I may say so, your mother misses you. She understands how busy you are, but perhaps a little more time with her would do you both good." For a moment, Aveline feared she had crossed some invisible boundary. But then Mitchell smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face, making him look years younger. "You're quite direct, aren't you, Miss Morgan?" he said. But there was no anger in his voice, just a kind of reluctant admiration. "I apologize if I was inappropriate," Aveline began, but Mitchell interrupted her with a gesture. "No, don't apologize. Refreshing. And you're right, of course. I should spend more time with her." He stood up, walking over to the window. For a moment, he was silent, staring out at the city below. When he turned back to Aveline, there was a new determination in his eyes. "I'm going to make an effort to have dinner with her at least 3 times a week from now on," he declared. "And I'd like you to join us, Miss Morgan. Your presence seems to calm things down." Aveline felt a mixture of surprise and something else, something she wasn't quite ready to name. "I'd be honored, Mr. Hartley." Mitchell nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Good. Now, about the charity event." They spent the next hour discussing the practical details of Eleanor's participation in the event. When Aveline finally left the office, she felt strangely energized, as if something important had changed, although she couldn't say exactly what. Back in her quarters, Aveline found herself replaying the conversation in her mind. The image of Mitchell smiling, the momentary vulnerability in his eyes, the warmth of his closeness. It all blended into a jumble of emotions that she wasn't prepared to untangle. One thing was certain. Her stay at the Hartley mansion had just become much more complicated, and potentially much more interesting, than she could ever have imagined. The day of the charity dinner arrived more quickly than Aveline had expected. The Hartley mansion had been buzzing since early morning, with a team of staff preparing everything for Eleanor's appearance at the event. Aveline found Eleanor in her bedroom, sitting in front of an ornate dressing table. The older woman looked pensive, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with a pearl necklace. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Hartley?" Aveline asked softly, approaching. Eleanor smiled, but there was a shadow of sadness in her eyes. "Oh, Aveline, dear, I'm just remembering. This event always makes me think of George, Mitchell's father. It was his idea, you know, to start this foundation." Aveline nodded, picking up a brush and beginning to gently comb Eleanor's silver hair. He must have been a remarkable man. He was, Eleanor confirmed, her eyes distant. Strong, visionary, but also kind. Mitchell looks so much like him sometimes. But he's also so different. There was a note of concern in Eleanor's voice that Aveline couldn't ignore. What do you mean? Eleanor sighed. George knew how to balance work and family. Mitchell, well, sometimes I'm afraid he's forgotten how to do that. Ever since he took over the business, it's as if a part of him has shut down. Aveline reflected on Eleanor's words, remembering the vulnerability she had glimpsed in Mitchell during their conversation in the office. Maybe he just needs a gentle reminder now and then, she suggested softly. An enigmatic smile passed Eleanor's lips. Maybe, and maybe you're exactly the reminder he needs, Aveline? Before Aveline could fully process what Eleanor meant by that, the bedroom door opened and Mitchell walked in. He looked impeccable in a black tuxedo, his hair perfectly groomed, but there was a tension in his shoulders that Aveline noticed immediately. Mom, are you... He stopped, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Aveline. For a moment, something indefinable flashed across his face before he pulled himself together. You look beautiful, Eleanor smiled, standing up with Aveline's help. Thank you, darling. Aveline did a wonderful job helping me get ready. Mitchell nodded, his eyes meeting Aveline's briefly. Yes, she has a talent for looking after people. There was something in the way he said it, a softness in his voice that made Aveline's heart skip a beat. She mentally scolded herself, reminding herself of her professional position. The car is waiting, Mitchell announced. Ms. Morgan, you're coming with us, of course. We'll need you to make sure my mother doesn't get too tired. The event itself was a whirlwind of lights, soft music, and polite conversation. Aveline stood discreetly next to Eleanor, watching with admiration as the older woman skillfully navigated the social interactions, despite her obvious fatigue. Mitchell, meanwhile, was in his element, charming donors and discussing future projects with an eloquence that Aveline couldn't help but admire. However, she noticed how his eyes often turned to her mother, checking on her well-being. It was during one of these moments of observation that Aveline found herself face-to-face with an elegant middle-aged woman who looked at her curiously. You must be Eleanor's new carer, the woman said, holding out her hand. I'm Victoria Blackwood, an old family friend. Aveline smiled, shaking the offered hand. Aveline Morgan, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood. Victoria studied her for a moment, a knowing smile on her lips. You know, it's refreshing to see someone so dedicated. Eleanor seems much livelier lately. And Mitchell, well, he seems less tense tonight. I imagine you had something to do with it. Aveline felt her cheeks heat up. I just do my job, Mrs. Blackwood. Victoria murmured, her gaze moving between Aveline and Mitchell, who was on the other side of the room. Sometimes, dear, our work takes us to unexpected places. Remember that. Before Aveline could reply, Victoria walked away with a nod, leaving her puzzled and slightly uncomfortable. The evening progressed, and Aveline noticed that Eleanor was beginning to show signs of fatigue. She discreetly approached Mitchell, lightly touching his arm to get his attention. The contact, though brief, sent a wave of warmth through her. Mitchell turned, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that left her momentarily breathless. Mr. Hartley, she said softly, I think your mother needs some rest. Mitchell nodded, his expression softening. Of course. I'll say the necessary goodbyes. Can you take her to the car? I'll meet you there in a few minutes. Aveline guided Eleanor gently out of the hall, feeling the older woman's relief at escaping the hustle and bustle of the party. You were wonderful tonight, Aveline said as she helped Eleanor settle into the car. Eleanor smiled tiredly. Thank you, dear. It was easier with you around. And Mitchell. He seemed different today, don't you think? Before Aveline could reply, Mitchell joined them in the car. The drive back to the mansion was silent, with Eleanor falling fast asleep and Aveline very aware of Mitchell's presence by her side. Back at the mansion, Aveline helped Eleanor get ready for bed. When she came out of her room, she found Mitchell waiting in the hallway. "Is she all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Aveline nodded. "Yes, just tired. She did very well tonight." "Thanks to you," Mitchell said softly. "Your idea of limiting her time at the event was perfect. And having you there, well, it made all the difference." Aveline felt her heart race at the compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. I'm glad I could help." They stood there for a moment, a heavy silence between them. Aveline found herself studying Mitchell's face, noticing how the soft light from the corridor softened his features, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "Aveline," he finally said, using her first name for the first time, "I wanted to thank you, not just for today, but for everything you've done for my mother, for us." The sudden intimacy of using his first name, combined with the sincerity in his voice, made Aveline feel as if the ground was moving beneath her feet. "It's my job," she replied automatically, but the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Mitchell stepped forward, reducing the distance between them. "We both know it's more than that." For a moment, Aveline thought he was going to come closer, that something was going to happen. Her heart was pounding so hard that she was sure he could hear it. But then, as if realizing what he was doing, Mitchell stepped back slightly. "Good night, Miss Morgan," he said, his voice hoarse. "Rest well." With that, he turned and left, leaving Aveline standing in the hallway, her heart racing and her mind in turmoil. As she prepared for bed, Aveline couldn't stop thinking about the night. The way Mitchell had looked at her, the electricity that seemed to crackle between them, Victoria Blackwood's enigmatic words. She knew she was entering dangerous territory. Mitchell was her employer, and his priority should be looking after Eleanor. But as sleep finally enveloped her, Aveline couldn't help wondering if fate didn't have other plans for her at Hartley Manor. What had begun as a simple caretaker's job was quickly turning into something much more complex, much more exciting, and potentially much more dangerous for her heart. The days following the charity dinner brought a subtle but noticeable change in the atmosphere of the Hartley mansion. Aveline noticed that Mitchell was fulfilling his promise to have dinner with his mother more often, and these family meals became moments she looked forward to with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. On one particularly pleasant evening, the three of them were sitting on the veranda, enjoying a light meal as the sun set over San Francisco. Eleanor was more animated than usual, her eyes sparkling as she told stories of her younger days. "Oh, you should have seen George back then," she laughed, a soft blush coloring her cheeks. "So charming and determined. He literally climbed over the trellis in my bedroom to kiss me goodnight." Mitchell choked on his wine, looking at his mother with a mixture of shock and amusement. "Dad did that? I can't imagine." "Your father was an incorrigible romantic," Eleanor smiled, her eyes distant with the memory. "He always said that when it comes to love, sometimes you have to take risks." Eleanor's gaze moved between Aveline and Mitchell, a puzzled expression on her face. "You know, sometimes I wonder if you two aren't too cautious. Life's too short not to follow your heart." A heavy silence fell over the table. Aveline felt her face heat up, carefully avoiding looking at Mitchell. When she finally mustered the courage to look up, she found his gaze fixed on her, an intensity in his green eyes that made her heart leap. "Mom," Mitchell finally said, his voice hoarse, "I think it's time you rested. It's been a long day." Eleanor sighed dramatically, but allowed Aveline to help her up. All right. I'll leave you two to clear the table." As Aveline guided Eleanor back to her room, she couldn't help but notice the satisfied smile on the older woman's face. "Mrs. Hartley," she began hesitantly, "about what you said outside." "Oh, dear," Eleanor interrupted her gently. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. I see the way you two look at each other when you think no one is paying attention." Aveline felt her heart racing. I don't know what you're talking about," she muttered, but the words sounded false even to her own ears. Eleanor just smiled, giving Aveline's hand a gentle pat. "Just remember, life is too precious to waste on fears and doubts. Sometimes we need to have the courage to follow our heart." With these enigmatic words, Eleanor retired for the night, leaving Aveline with swirling thoughts and a troubled heart. When Aveline returned to the balcony, she found Mitchell still sitting at the table, absent-mindedly swirling a glass of wine in his hands. He raised his eyes as she approached, and for a moment, Aveline saw a vulnerability in his gaze that left her breathless. "Miss Morgan," he said softly. "Aveline, I think we need to talk." Aveline felt her heart leap into her throat. She nodded silently, sitting down in the chair next to him. Mitchell began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "This is harder than I thought." Aveline waited patiently, her own heart beating so loudly that she was sure he could hear it. "Since you arrived," Mitchell finally continued, his voice low and intense, "things have changed. My mother is happier, more alive than I've seen her in years, and I find myself looking forward to coming home every night, something that hasn't happened for a long time." He turned to face her directly, his green eyes shining with an emotion Aveline couldn't name. "You've brought something back to this house, Aveline. Something I didn't even know was missing." Aveline felt her breath catch. "Mr. Hartley." "Mitchell," she whispered. "No," he interrupted her gently. "Please let me finish. I know this is complicated. You work for me. You look after my mother. There's a line that shouldn't be crossed, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling any longer." He reached out, gently touching Aveline's face. She closed her eyes, instinctively leaning into the touch. "I think," Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I'm falling in love with you, Aveline Morgan." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Aveline opened her eyes, meeting Mitchell's intense gaze. All the tension, all the electricity that had grown between them over the last few weeks seemed to culminate in this moment. "Mitchell," she breathed, her heart threatening to explode in her chest. I feel something too, something that scares me and thrills me at the same time." He smiled then, a genuine smile that lit up his whole face. Slowly, as if he feared she might pull away, Mitchell leaned forward. Their lips met in a soft kiss, hesitant at first, but quickly deepening with all the pent-up emotion of the last few weeks. Aveline felt as if she were floating and falling at the same time, her whole body buzzing with the electricity of the moment. When they finally separated, they were both panting. Mitchell leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "It changes everything," he murmured. And it was true. At that moment, Aveline knew that nothing would ever be the same. The delicate balance she had worked so hard to maintain had been irrevocably altered. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mitchell pulled away slightly, taking her hands in his. "I don't know," he admitted. "This is complicated. There's a lot at stake. My mother, the company, your career." Aveline nodded, the reality of the situation beginning to set in. Maybe we should take a step back. Think about the implications of all this." A shadow passed across Mitchell's face, but he nodded. "You're right, of course. We need to be prudent." They sat in silence for a few moments, still holding hands, the air around them charged with possibilities and unspoken fears. Finally, Mitchell stood up, pulling Aveline gently with him. "It's late," he said softly. "We should rest. Tomorrow we can talk more." Aveline nodded, her whole body still vibrating with the emotion of the kiss. "Good night, Mitchell," she whispered. He smiled, bringing her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Good night, Aveline." As she walked back to her room, Aveline felt like she was walking on a cloud. Her heart and mind were in conflict, the emotion of the moment fighting against practical concerns about the future. Lying in her bed, unable to sleep, Aveline replayed the night's events in her mind. The kiss, Mitchell's confession, the feeling that something monumental had changed. She knew that the days ahead would be challenging. There would be difficult decisions to be made, complicated conversations to be had. But at that moment, lying in the darkness with the taste of Mitchell's kiss still on her lips, Aveline allowed herself to dream of the possibilities. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for tonight, she allowed herself to simply feel the joy, the fear, the anticipation. Because, as Eleanor had said, sometimes it takes courage to follow your heart. And Aveline was beginning to realize that her heart was leading her down a path she could never have imagined when she arrived at Hartley Manor. With these thoughts swirling around in her mind, Aveline finally fell asleep, dreaming of green eyes and whispered promises under the starry San Francisco sky. The next morning brought with it a mixture of emotions for Aveline. She woke up with her heart racing, the memories of the night before still vivid in her mind. The kiss, the whispered words, the promise of something more. It all seemed at once wonderfully real and frighteningly complicated. As she prepared for the day, Aveline couldn't help but wonder how things would be now. How should she act around Mitchell? And what about Eleanor? The older woman seemed to have noticed the attraction between them, but how would she react knowing that things had progressed? With a deep sigh, Aveline looked at herself in the mirror, determined to face the day with professional composure, no matter how difficult it might be. Going down to the kitchen, Aveline was surprised to find Mitchell already there, preparing coffee. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Good morning," he said softly, a hesitant smile on his lips. "Good morning," Aveline replied, feeling her cheeks heat up. "Are you making coffee?" Mitchell laughed softly, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that Aveline already recognized as a sign of nervousness. "I thought we could have a chat before the day really starts. Coffee?" Aveline nodded, accepting the cup he offered her. They sat down at the kitchen table, a silence hanging between them. "About last night," Mitchell began, his voice low and intense. "I meant every word, Aveline, but I also understand that our situation is complicated." Aveline nodded, her fingers tightening on her coffee cup. "It is complicated," she agreed. "Mitchell, I feel something for you, something I never expected to feel. But I also have responsibilities here, with your mother, with my job." "I know," he said, reaching out to touch her hand gently. "And that's why we need to be careful. Think carefully about what we want and how we can make it work, if at all." Before Aveline could reply, the sound of approaching footsteps made them move away quickly. Eleanor entered the kitchen, her eyes shining with barely disguised curiosity. "Good morning, dears," she said cheerfully. "What a pleasant surprise to see you both here so early." Aveline exchanged a quick glance with Mitchell before getting up to help Eleanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartley. How are you feeling today?" As she prepared breakfast for Eleanor, Aveline could feel Mitchell's gaze on her. The tension in the air was palpable, and she wondered if Eleanor could feel it too. The day passed in a haze of routine activities and charged moments. Whenever Aveline and Mitchell met, there was an electricity in the air, an unspoken desire to continue their interrupted conversation. It was in the late afternoon, while Eleanor was taking her usual nap, that Aveline finally found a moment alone with Mitchell. She found him in his office, leaning over some documents. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, closing the door behind her. Mitchell looked up, a tired but genuine smile lighting up his face. "Of course. Actually, I was hoping we could." He stood up, stepping around the table to be closer to her. For a moment, they stood there, just looking at each other, the weight of everything that hadn't been said hanging between them. "Aveline," Mitchell began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've spent all day thinking about you, about us, and I've come to a conclusion." Aveline felt her heart racing. "And what is that?" "I want this," he said simply. "I want us. I know it's complicated, that there are obstacles, but you're worth it. What I feel for you is worth the fight." Mitchell's words hit her with full force. Aveline felt tears forming in her eyes, a mixture of joy and fear taking hold of her. "Mitchell," she whispered, "I want it too. But how can we make it work? Your world, my job." He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "We can figure it out together. It won't be easy, but I believe we can find a way, if you're willing to try." Aveline looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity, hope, and love that reflected her own feelings. At that moment, she knew she couldn't deny what she felt, no matter how scary or complicated it might be. "I'm willing," she finally said, a smile trembling on her lips. "Let's give it a try." Mitchell's face lit up with a radiant smile. He pulled her close, enveloping her in a tight hug. Aveline allowed herself to melt into the embrace, feeling, for the first time in a long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. When they separated, Mitchell held her face gently. "We'll have to be discreet, at least at first. We need to figure out how to handle this professionally and how to tell my mother." Aveline nodded, the reality of the situation setting in again. "Yes, you're right. We need to be careful. But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy the moments we have," Mitchell added with a mischievous smile. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a soft but passionate kiss. When the kiss ended, Aveline felt dizzy, her heart beating fast. "This is going to be harder than I thought," she laughed softly. Mitchell smiled, stroking her cheek. "It's worth every second." The sound of a door closing in the hallway made them separate quickly. The reality of their situation returned with full force. "I should go and check on Eleanor," Aveline said, reluctant to leave, but aware of her responsibilities. Mitchell nodded, taking a step back. "Of course. See you at dinner." Aveline smiled, feeling a surge of happiness at the thought of spending more time with him. "Yes, I'll see you at dinner." As she left the office, Aveline felt as if she were floating. She knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, balancing her work with her nascent relationship, navigating social and professional expectations, and eventually telling Eleanor. But at that moment, everything seemed possible. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine activities, each punctuated by stolen glances and secret smiles exchanged with Mitchell. During dinner, Aveline had to struggle to maintain a facade of normality, especially under Eleanor's watchful eye. Later, lying in her bed, Aveline reflected on the twists and turns her life had taken. When she had taken the job of caretaker at Hartley Manor, she could never have imagined where it would lead her. Now, she found herself at the beginning of a relationship that promised to be as exciting as it was challenging. Closing her eyes, Aveline allowed herself to dream of the future. A future with Mitchell, a future full of possibilities. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be obstacles to overcome and difficult decisions to make. But for the first time in a long time, Aveline felt truly hopeful. With a smile on her lips, she fell asleep, her heart full of love and her spirit ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Because now she knew she was no longer alone. She had Mitchell by her side, and together, they could face anything. The road ahead was uncertain, but Aveline was ready to take it, one step at a time, with the man who had captured her heart in ways she could never have predicted. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Aveline. Balancing her role as Eleanor's carer with her secret relationship with Mitchell proved to be more of a challenge than she had imagined. Every shared glance, every furtive touch, carried the weight of her secret. One sunny Sunday afternoon, Aveline was helping Eleanor in the garden when the older woman asked a question that took her by surprise. "Darling," Eleanor began, her shrewd eyes fixed on Aveline, "is there something you'd like to tell me?" Aveline felt her heart leap. I don't understand what you mean, Mrs. Hartley." Eleanor smiled, a knowing twinkle in her eyes. "Oh, I think you do. You and Mitchell have been different lately. Happier, I'd say. Lighter." Aveline felt the blush creep up her neck. She and Mitchell had been so careful, or at least they thought they had been. But of course Eleanor, with her insight and intimate knowledge of her son, would have noticed the change. "Mrs. Hartley, Aveline began, unsure of how to proceed. Eleanor held up a hand, gently interrupting her. "You don't have to explain, dear. I just want you to know that whatever is happening between you and my son, you have my blessing." Eleanor's words hit her hard. Aveline felt tears forming in her eyes, a mixture of relief and gratitude taking over. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tinged with emotion. "It means a lot to me. To us." Eleanor smiled, reaching out to take Aveline's hand. You've brought light back into this house, Aveline, and into my son's heart. How could I not approve of that? At that moment, Aveline felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. With Eleanor's blessing, the future seemed a little brighter, a little more possible. Later that evening, Aveline met Mitchell in his office. She could hardly contain her excitement as she shared the conversation she'd had with Eleanor. "Does she know?" Mitchell asked, a mixture of surprise and relief in his voice. "And she approves?" Aveline nodded, a beaming smile on her face. "Yes, she said we have her blessing." Mitchell pulled her into a tight hug, laughing with joy. When he pulled away, there was a new determination in his eyes. "This changes everything, Aveline," he said, holding her face gently. "We don't have to hide anymore. We can be open about our relationship." Aveline felt a wave of happiness, but also a twinge of worry. "What about my work? People will talk." Mitchell shook his head, his gaze firm. "Let them talk. You're more than capable at your job, and no one can question that. Besides, I'm tired of hiding how I feel about you." With those words, he kissed her, a kiss full of promise and possibility. Aveline allowed herself to melt into the moment, feeling as if everything was finally falling into place. However, life is rarely so simple, and the challenges were far from over. Over the next few weeks, as Aveline and Mitchell navigated their now open relationship, rumors began to circulate. At the next Hartley Foundation charity gala, Aveline could feel the stares and hear the whispers as she walked alongside Mitchell. "Don't mind them," Mitchell murmured, squeezing her hand reassuringly. "They'll get used to it eventually." Aveline tried to smile, but she couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. She knew that many saw her as an opportunist, a caretaker who had seduced the wealthy Hartley heir. The irony of how far this was from the truth didn't escape her. It was during this gala that Aveline had an encounter that would shake her newfound confidence. Victoria Blackwood, the family friend she had met months before, approached her when Mitchell was called in for a chat with some donors. "Miss Morgan," Victoria said, her voice sweet but with an edge of steel. "Or should I say, future Mrs. Hartley?" Aveline felt her stomach turn. "Mrs. Blackwood, Oh, don't worry, dear," Victoria interrupted her, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm not here to judge you, just to offer some friendly advice." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The world Mitchell lives in is very different from yours. There are expectations, traditions, people like us. Well, we're not always welcome. Be prepared to fight if you really want to." With one last enigmatic smile, Victoria walked away, leaving Aveline stunned and unsure. Victoria's words echoed in her mind for the rest of the night. Even with Mitchell by her side, smiling and proudly introducing her as his partner, Aveline couldn't shake the feeling that she was entering a world she wasn't ready for. Later, back at the mansion, Aveline found Eleanor in the library. The older woman must have noticed her worried expression, because she immediately put her book aside. "What's bothering you, dear?" she asked gently. Aveline hesitated for a moment before venting, sharing her worries in Victoria's words. Eleanor listened attentively, her face a mixture of understanding and determination. "Aveline," she finally said, her voice firm, "Victoria isn't completely wrong. The world we are born into can be cruel to those who come from outside. But let me tell you something. You have more strength and grace than half those people put together." Eleanor took Aveline's hands in hers, her eyes shining with conviction. "What's more, you have something they'll never have. Mitchell's true love. And believe me, that's worth more than any title or bank account." Eleanor's words calmed Aveline's turbulent heart. She knew that challenges still lay ahead, but with Eleanor's support and Mitchell's love, she felt stronger to face them. That night, lying in Mitchell's arms, Aveline shared her worries with him. He listened to her attentively, his expression becoming more serious with every word. "Aveline," he finally said, his voice full of emotion, "I'm sorry you have to go through this, but I want you to know, you're the most incredible person I've ever met. I don't care what anyone thinks or says, I love you, and I'll be by your side no matter what." Aveline felt tears of joy and relief run down her face. "I love you too, Mitchell," she whispered. They kissed, a kiss full of promise and determination. In that moment, Aveline knew that no matter what challenges came, they would face them together. As sleep enveloped her, Aveline reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From a simple caregiver to a beloved member of the Hartley family, she had come a long way. And although the future was still uncertain, with challenges and obstacles ahead, Aveline knew she had found her place, alongside Mitchell and Eleanor, in a family that had welcomed her with an open heart. With this comforting thought, she fell asleep, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought, with love and determination in her heart. Autumn arrived in San Francisco, painting the city in shades of gold and red. For Aveline, the last few months had been a roller coaster of emotions, challenges, and, above all, love. Her relationship with Mitchell had blossomed, despite the obstacles they had faced. That Saturday morning, Aveline woke up to the soft sound of Mitchell's breathing beside her. She smiled, allowing herself a few moments to simply enjoy the peace of the moment. Who would have thought that a year ago, when she arrived at Hartley Manor as a simple caretaker, her life would change so drastically? The sound of a soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Aveline? Mitchell? Are you awake?" Eleanor's voice came from the other side of the door. "We are. Mom?" Mitchell replied, his voice hoarse with sleep. "Come in." Eleanor entered the room, a beaming smile on her face. "Good morning, my dears. Sorry to interrupt, but I have a surprise for you." Aveline and Mitchell exchanged curious glances before sitting down on the bed. Eleanor approached, holding an envelope in her hands. "What's this, Mom?" Mitchell asked, intrigued. Eleanor handed them the envelope, her eyes shining with anticipation. "Open it and see for yourselves." Carefully, Aveline opened the envelope, pulling out a set of legal documents. Her eyes widened as she read the contents. "Eleanor, this is—" she began, her voice cracking with emotion. Mitchell took the papers, reading them quickly. Her face lit up with understanding and surprise. "Mom, you're transferring part of the company's shares to Aveline." Eleanor nodded, her smile widening. "Yes, my dear. Aveline is not just the woman you love. She has become an essential part of this family. I thought it was time to make it official." Aveline felt tears forming in her eyes. "Eleanor, I don't know what to say. This is too much." The older woman sat on the edge of the bed, taking Aveline's hands in hers. "It's not too much, darling. It's exactly what you deserve. You've brought so much joy and love into our lives. This is just a small gesture of gratitude." Mitchell wrapped Aveline in a tight hug, kissing the top of her head. "Mom's right, love. You deserve this and so much more." At that moment, enveloped in the love of her new family, Aveline felt a wave of gratitude and happiness so intense that she could hardly breathe. She had found not just love, but a real home. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The news of Aveline's official inclusion in the Hartley family business caused a stir in San Francisco's high society. Some applauded the decision, seeing it as a progressive move. Others, of course, couldn't help but speculate wildly. It was during a Hartley Foundation benefit dinner that Aveline faced her final test. She was chatting to some donors when Victoria Blackwood approached, her smile as sweet as it was poisonous. "Aveline, darling," Victoria said, her voice laden with false cordiality. "I heard the news. It looks like you've really made it, doesn't it? From carer to Hartley heiress. Impressive." Aveline felt Mitchell tense beside her, but before he could intervene, she took a deep breath and replied, "Mrs. Blackwood, I appreciate your observation. But let me make something clear. I didn't get anything other than the love of a wonderful family. The shares are a gesture of trust and affection, not an award. And as for my role as a caregiver, I'm still proud of it. Looking after Eleanor has brought me more joy and fulfillment than any title or bank account ever could." Victoria's smile faltered for a moment, clearly taken aback by Aveline's firm response. Mitchell, with a proud smile, added, "And I must add, Victoria, that Aveline has brought innovative ideas to our charity projects. Her background in healthcare has been invaluable in expanding our reach. Victoria muttered something unintelligible before walking away, leaving Aveline and Mitchell alone. "You were amazing," Mitchell whispered, kissing Aveline's temple. "I'm so proud of you." Aveline smiled, feeling stronger and more confident than ever. She had faced her fears and proved her worth, not just to others, but to herself. As the evening progressed, Aveline found herself reflecting on her journey. From a young nurse looking for a fresh start to a confident and loved woman, she had come a long way. Later, back at the mansion, Aveline found Eleanor in the library, her favorite place for intimate conversations. "How was your evening, dear?" Eleanor asked, a knowing glint in her eyes. Aveline smiled, taking a seat next to the woman who had become a second mother to her. "It was enlightening. I think I've finally found my place, Eleanor." Eleanor took Aveline's hand, squeezing it gently. "You've always had your place here, Aveline. From day one. You just needed time to realize it." Eleanor's words warmed Aveline's heart. She leaned over, hugging the older woman affectionately. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." That night, lying in Mitchell's arms, Aveline shared her thoughts about the future. "I've been thinking," she began, tracing lazy patterns on Mitchell's chest. "What if we used part of the Foundation's resources to create a home care program for the elderly? Something that combines medical care with companionship and emotional support." Mitchell looked at her with admiration. "That's brilliant, Aveline. It's exactly the kind of project that can make a real difference to people's lives." Aveline smiled, feeling energized by the idea. "We could start small, maybe here in San Francisco, and then expand. I wonder how many lives we could touch." "We'll make it happen," Mitchell promised, kissing her softly. Together. As sleep enveloped them, Aveline reflected on how much her life had changed in just 1 year. She had arrived at Hartley Manor in search of a fresh start and found so much more than she could ever have imagined. Love, family, and a renewed purpose. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities. With Mitchell by her side and Eleanor as her mentor and second mother, Aveline knew she could face any challenge that came her way. As San Francisco fell asleep outside, Aveline closed her eyes, her heart overflowing with gratitude and love. She had found her home, not just in the Hartley mansion, but in the hearts of the people she now called family. And so, with a smile on her lips and dreams of a bright future, Aveline fell asleep, ready for the next chapter of her life, a chapter filled with love, purpose, and the promise of making a difference in the world, one heart at a time.